Hello and welcome to the National Constitution Center. We are so thrilled that you are joining us today for a virtual tour of our American Treasures exhibit. My name is Madison. I'm a member of the center's education team, and I'm also joined by one of our fabulous museum educators, Wynn. So Wynn has the delightful task of taking us through live in person at the museum, our American Treasures exhibit. And Wynn is going to discuss those three key principles that we find embedded into the Constitution. We're going to talk about natural rights, popular sovereignty, and of course, the rule of law. So if you have questions for Wynn or myself throughout the tour, please pop those into the chat. We are here and more than happy to answer them. And then we'll also save some time at the end for Q&A. This is going to be about a 25-30-minute long tour, and then we're going to go ahead and break for that Q&A. Hello to all of our friends who are tuning in. We are so happy that you're here, and we are going to go ahead and get started. So without further ado, Wynn, I pass it off to you.
Well, thank you so much, Madison. Hello, everyone from Minnesota, New Jersey, New York, Los Angeles, wherever you're tuning in from. We are so happy to have you. I am standing here in the National Constitution Center in one of our lesser known but most amazing exhibits, American Treasures. And we're going to be looking at some original drafts of the Constitution, of the Bill of Rights, and talking about the three principles that we find enshrined in all of them. And as Madison mentioned, we're talking about popular sovereignty, rule of law, and natural rights. So you may be wondering, what exactly are these terms? How did they come about? And you are in the right place to learn those. So I want to start by just defining pretty simply what these terms are. So starting with popular sovereignty, it's really enshrined in the first three words of the Constitution. I know you know them. We know and love them here. We the people. Popular sovereignty is the idea that the most legitimate form of government, of constitutional government, is derived, it comes from we the people. We in the United States are the ones in charge of our government. Not only do we get a say in elections, but we get to express our own opinions about what we think should be allowed or maybe not allowed in the United States. That's this concept of popular sovereignty, that we, the people, the populace, are in charge of our sovereign nation. Now, moving on to rule of law. This one is pretty simple. Sounds exactly like what it is. It is that the law is the ruler. No one is above the law. It's the basic idea that we, our government, is a creation of laws. And so no one, not a king, not the president, not you or me, not your teachers, not your parents, are above following the law. It was originally written into the Constitution, these concept of laws, who can make them, who is checked and balanced on those, and we're going to get into that later. Now, our last concept is probably the most difficult one for us to grasp. It's the idea of natural rights. And the rights that we are born with, they are natural, they are inherent to us as people, and they are not granted by the government. The government didn't give us a ticket and said, you are allowed to do this. We were already born with this right. A really good example that we'd like to use here is the right of conscience. Essentially means you have the right to your own thoughts, your own opinions, your beliefs, your values. The government does not say that you are allowed to do this. You already are born with them. You are born with the right to think and express your opinions. Now, it gets a little bit trickier when we get into the laws surrounding natural rights, but those are the basic concepts we're talking about today: popular sovereignty, rule of law, and natural rights. I want to start by talking a little bit more in depth about popular sovereignty. And to do that, I'm going to need the help of one of my friends, who I will show you right over here. One of our lesser known, but perhaps most influential founding fathers. This is James Wilson, a fellow glasses wearer here. Now, James Wilson was born in Scotland, and he immigrated here to the British colonies in 1765. And he was an adamant supporter of this concept of popular sovereignty, of we the people, that we are in charge of our own government. You can see from this quote up here, in the Constitution, all authority is derived from the people. That was Wilson's hope for us. That was his belief. Now, he was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, of the Constitution of the United States, and so he is one of our most prolific founding fathers, and many of the drafts that we have in this exhibit are from Mr. Wilson himself. And he knew a lot about this idea of popular sovereignty. He came from Scotland, he joined the British colonies, and he called this government tyrannical. It was run by a monarchy, a king, the King of England, King George III, and regular, everyday, average people didn't really have a say in the government. And Mr. Wilson was determined to make sure that wasn't the case in the United States. So I want to show you one of his early drafts that we have of the Constitution. It's really, really cool. And one of the most fascinating things about it is that these first three words that enshrine popular sovereignty, and I'll get you a good look at this draft here. Those first three words weren't actually part of some of the original first drafts. So if you take a look at this paper here, you might notice it says, "We the people of the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and et cetera, et cetera." Those F's are actually S's. A little fun fact for you about old-fashioned handwriting. So this draft, which was, excuse me, a copy that was annotated by Edmund Randolph, another gentleman in this convention, shows that even though popular sovereignty was a major concept that we were working towards, maybe we didn't quite have a handle on it first. We were separate nations. We all thought of ourselves as Pennsylvanians, as folks from Virginia, as North Carolinians. We didn't quite think of ourselves yet as one big, large nation all together. And that's what this early draft really shows. Now, eventually, this language gets changed to "we the people of the United States." And that's where it sticks. That's where it stays. And that's really this idea of popular sovereignty coming to light. Over the 3 months that the men were here at the Constitutional Convention, they came in with this goal of popular sovereignty and really saw themselves as becoming this populace. They became this collective. And it was really evident in the later drafts of the Constitution that I'll get to show you a little bit later on. So this is a really great example of popular sovereignty. And there were many, many folks in this convention who agreed with Mr. Wilson. And I want to tell you about another fellow who I will take you over to show you, who was pretty well known at this time, a little different than Mr. Wilson, perhaps. He is often called the father of the Constitution. So let's go meet James Madison here. Let me get you a nice angle so you can see his beautiful portrait. Now, James Madison is about as nerdy as you can get with the Constitution. He was really a constitutional nerd. He came to the convention that was held right here in Philadelphia in 1787, a few weeks before anyone else even got there. He got there early and started basically pulling out his homework. He had read constitutions of the past from around the world, constitutions from his home state of Virginia, and was basically trying to pick out the parts he liked best and draft his own early constitution. So when everyone else came and joined him, George Washington, James Wilson, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison already had a head start. He had already thought of some ideas and concepts. And one of the most tricky concepts, one of the hardest things that they had to debate in this convention was how our government was going to work in general. We had just come from a monarchy. All right, we didn't like the monarchy system. We know what we don't want. But what do we want? And what James Madison and others in the convention eventually got to was this idea of the rule of law. They said that no one should be above the government. Our Constitution should outline what exactly is and is not allowed of our government so that we can make sure we don't end up with another king. We don't end up with a situation where we are not represented in our government. And that's where the rule of law really comes from. Of course, the ideas are almost centuries old that no one should be above the law, but it really is enshrined with James Madison's early drafts of the Constitution. And I want to show you one of those early drafts that are going to be right here behind me. So I will spin you around here. So there were a couple of different committees that they call them in the Constitutional Convention. I want to show you this one right here. Let me get you a nice zoom in. Make sure you don't get to see my computer in the distance here. All right, let's get it to focus. There we go. It's a little tricky to see because of the glare here to protect our documents, but if you can see, it says, "We the people of the United States," getting to that newer version of the preamble that includes that popular sovereignty. And then the whole document goes on, starting with Article 1. Now, Article 1 outlines the legislative branch in the Constitution. If you remember, we have 3 branches of government: the legislative, judicial, and the executive, of course. And all have their different roles and all of their different functions. But what the Founding Fathers really wanted to make sure was that neither of them would be the ones in charge. The president doesn't have ultimate power or ultimate say. Congress does not have ultimate power or ultimate say. This system, we like to call it the system of checks and balances, was one of the most important and really influential things that they created. They made sure that if someone did overstep their boundaries, if they did sort of infringe on the toes of the other branches, that there was a system in place to make sure that doesn't happen again. And if it does happen, they were to make sure that the other branches had their own say. For example, you see in Article 1 here, it outlines the legislative process. When Congress decides to pass a law, they draft it, it goes through committee, it goes through all of these different things, and then it gets placed on the desk of the President of the United States. And they get to decide if it is approved or not approved. If they do not approve this law, it's called a veto. It then gets sent back to the legislative branch, back to Congress, and they sort of figure out what to do next. All right, if we really believe that this law should exist, then we're going to push for it harder. And there's a way to overturn the president's veto. And if all is said and done and this law is passed and it's on the books and we're all following it here in the United States, the judicial branch then has the power to say, wait a minute, I don't think this law follows the Constitution. I don't think Congress was allowed to do this. And that's where that system of checks and balances really comes into play. No one is above the law. The law is final. The Constitution is what we all follow here in the United States, from your smallest, littlest cousin at your house all the way up to the President of the United States. No one is above the law. That's one of the most amazing concepts that I personally feel that our founding fathers worked really hard to create. Now, our last concept that I want to bring you to here today is the concept of natural rights. And if you remember, this one's a little bit trickier, but let me give you a phrase that maybe sounds correct. Excuse me. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among which the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are what our founding fathers believed were our natural rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are written into the Declaration of Independence. And during this Constitutional Convention, when all of these drafts here were being created, they had to figure out how they were going to put it in the Constitution. And it wasn't perhaps as straightforward or as simple as you might think. I want to take you over here to see some of our early drafts of the Bill of Rights. You can see a few here behind me, and I'll get you a close-up look at one in just a few minutes. But I want to talk about the Bill of Rights because it was actually a point of contention. There were some members of this Constitutional Convention who felt that the Constitution was incomplete without a Bill of Rights. So they needed to add one as soon as possible, right away, even that very same day. There were 3 men We call them the dissenters here. They're upstairs in our signers hall, a room with all of our 42 statues. It's really cool if you ever get a chance to come see it in person. Now, these three men decided to not sign the Constitution for various different reasons, but mostly because it didn't already include this Bill of Rights. Now, the Bill of Rights eventually ended up passing just a few years later, and its anniversary is coming up on December 15th, and we're celebrating Bill of Rights Day here at the Constitution Center if you're around. And it's the first 10 amendments to the Constitution of the United States. But it wasn't always 10. James Madison, who we talked about earlier, actually had several different amendments that he wanted pushed. And I want to show you one of the newspapers that published James Madison's early draft of the Bill of Rights, which actually included 12. So not the 10 that we know today, but 12. And I'll get you a nice look here. Let me close that. Beautiful. So right where you see these little yellow indentations, that's where this is going to start. And it goes and lists the articles of the Constitution, and then it starts to list the different rights that James Madison believed we should outline. You see it goes all the way up, I'll get you a nice look, to Article 12. So there were a lot of different rights that was debated over time. And yes, the Bill of Rights is the first 10, but I'm sure you all know how many amendments we have now to the Constitution. 27. So 27 changes have been made to the Constitution, most of which have to do with this idea of natural rights. How are we going to make sure that the citizens of the United States, their rights are upheld? They're not deprived of any of their rights. One of the most famous ended up being the First Amendment to the Constitution. There are 5 freedoms listed in that First Amendment, and I'm sure you know them deep down in your heart. They are freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, the right to assemble, and the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. The freedom of speech is one that we talk about so often because it's so broad, and the language that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights uses is very vague. So through a series of court cases brought up to the Supreme Court, we have further defined what exactly our freedom of speech is, our freedom to express, to not only say what you want, but write what you want, wear what you want, and do what you want. We call all of those things speech, whether they're symbolic, whether they're written, or whether they're spoken out loud. All of these things are examples of our natural rights that our founding fathers really tried to emphasize and push for. All right, that was a bit of information overload, but I hope now you have a better understanding of what all of these concepts and principles are. We think about them as starting in the American Revolution, but really they started so many years before that, as many different philosophers of the Enlightenment and extremely educated individuals who came here to create our government began to think of these 3 principles. Again, they are rule of law, popular sovereignty, and natural rights. They are extremely difficult to fully understand, but pretty simple when you see them written in the Constitution, in the Declaration of Independence, and in the Bill of Rights. I hope that you'll one day get to come and visit us and see even more of these early drafts, but I hope that I gave you a really good look at some of the most amazing early artifacts from the United States. And with that, I'd love to see if you have any questions for me about these 3 concepts, about any of these documents that we saw today, or anything else in the museum that you may be curious about. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, I'm ready for you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Wynn. That was a fabulous look at the principles of the American Revolution. And like you mentioned, some of those can feel like pretty big concepts that we have to unpack. But as you so diligently pointed out, we can find them in the Constitution. We'll wait while our friends tune in for some questions and let us know their thoughts, their comments, what questions they have. But I think that was fabulous, and I want to thank you so much for your time and for your expertise. And I will offer just a subtle plug to our friends watching. Remember that we do these virtual tours a lot. We're going to do them throughout the school year in all of our exhibit spaces. So next month, I believe we're going to be looking at those dissenters that Wynn mentioned, those three gentlemen who did not sign the Constitution. And we'll also take a look at our another rare documents gallery as well. But you have a lot of opportunities to see Wynn, myself, other members of the education team throughout the school year. So please feel free to tune in. And Wynn, it looks like we have our first question, or one of our first questions. Wynn, I'm going to let you take it away. Tara has a question. What happened to the 2 amendments in the Bill of Rights that were not included? Please let us know.
Oh, my friend, you have opened up a fantastic can of worms, because boy, do I have a story for you. Now, of the 12 amendments that James Madison originally drafted, of course, we know only 10 were passed in the Bill of Rights, but one of those amendments would actually pass 200 years later. The 27th Amendment, the most recent amendment, is actually originally one of the amendments that James Madison proposed. And the story that goes with it is actually really fascinating. So there was a young gentleman who was in college, and he had an assignment to write a paper. And the paper was about, if you were to amend the Constitution, what would you change? Really interesting assignment that I encourage you all to think about yourself. And this young gentleman who was in college decided to go digging through some of the early drafts of the Constitution, much like we did today. And he found one of James Madison's original amendments that he proposed, which essentially says that Congress is not allowed to give themselves a pay raise while they are still in session. And he thought that it would be a really good idea. He was surprised that it didn't pass in the first place. And so he wrote this paper about this amendment. He actually got a C on his paper because his teacher didn't think it was an original idea, which it wasn't. It was James Madison's. But this actually started a whole movement to get this passed. And eventually it did passed through Congress, was ratified by 3/4 of the states, and became our 27th Amendment in the 1990s, our most recent amendment. So that's definitely one of the most interesting stories of what happened with those original 12 amendments. That's a great question.
That was fantastic. And friends, I put in the chat a link so you can learn more about that term paper that got a C, but managed to change constitutional history forever. So that's very exciting. We have here, Wynn, do you know, Joanne would like to know, how much did the founding fathers change the original draft of James Madison's, this big constitution, the Bill of Rights, and more? Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. It's a great question. And it's pretty clear to see when you walk around this room that a lot of the edits were really small. Now, the ideas themselves, the idea of rule of law, how our government should be created, how we're going to be represented, changed a lot. They were hotly debated in the Constitutional Convention. If you remember, perhaps one of the most famous folks who were there, Alexander Hamilton, had very different ideas of how our government should function than perhaps James Madison. There was a lot of debate over which plans worked best. Should larger states get more representation in government? Should every state have equal representation? So a lot of these ideas were bounced around. And I'm sure James Madison, as all of these ideas were being spoken, was furiously writing them down and trying to get them in his Constitution. Eventually, when the Committee of Detail and the Committee of Style were assembled, they started writing the language of the Constitution, which went through a couple of different changes, most of them pretty minor. But of course, the most significant, at least in my opinion, I think, was the changing of the preamble, changing that to "We the people of the United States." And we have another gallery here at the Constitution Center called the Bill of Rights Gallery, which we do have another virtual class coming up in just a few weeks about it, that goes through some of the voting process of these original 12 amendments and the voting and ratification process of the Constitution. So you can see in real time which states voted for or against certain resolutions in the Constitution. It really is an amazing process to see happen.
Thank you, Wynn. All right, friends, I'm going to feel free to stick around if you have more questions, but I'm going to go ahead and end this recording, but we will absolutely get to your questions. So stick around. I'm just going to end the recording here.